Angelingua gloriosi corporis mysterium, sanguinisque preciosi, quem in mundi pretium, fructus ventris generosi, rex effuit gentium. Nobis natus es intacta Virgine, et in mundo conversatus falso verbis semine, sui moras incolatus miro clausit ordine, in supreme nocte celere recumbens cum fratribus, observata lege plene civis in legalibus, cibum turbe duodene sedat suis manibus, verbum caro parem verbum carnem efficit, fique sanguis Christi merum epsi sensus deficit, ad firmandum cors in celum sola fides officit. Tantum ergo sacramentum veneremur cernui, et antiquum documentum novo cedat ritui, prestet fides supplementum sensum defectui. Genitori, laus et jubilatio, salus honor virtus quoque sit et benedictio, procedenti ab utroque comparsit laudatio.
Candida armes Deum et in alus edesi, iste redempta omnium esari preces sublici, qui condolens interitum otis perine seculum, salvasti mundum languidum, donans Deis remedium, mergente mundi vespere utis consus detala, egresus honestissima virginis matris clausula, Salvetus gloria Deo Patri et Filii, una cum Sancto Spiritu, in sempiterna saecula. Amen.
Verbum Patris summa naturo, tempuella salutaturo, salutator fecundatur virinesia. Hey, 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 nova gaudia. Novus modus genitureo, sed excedens natureo, cum unite creatore creans omnia. Ea nova gaudia. Audi pater pretermoremo, Virgo parit salvatoremo, creatura creatorem patrem filia. Hey, hey, hey,
What's good, boys? Lots of technical difficulties to start this stream off with, but I think I fixed it. Today, we're going to be going over this idea of the trivium as a way to think. And to get to the point where you understand what the trivium is, we're going to have to basically give a little bit of a brief history of education as a whole. and it's going to be brief, but the main narrative is going to kind of show how we got to this point in education today. Let me switch over to the screen now. So you kind of have this narrative pushed a lot nowadays from people like Tate, lots of other figures online that have this like anti-school, college sucks, college is pointless, all these different things, right, that they point out and they'll say. And a lot of it has merit. It's not just completely pointless, but they don't ever expand upon it. They just say it's crappy. They'll like appeal to certain things that you might be familiar with. But other than that, they don't really expand too much upon it. And with a little brief history lesson, we'll understand how it got to where it is today. We'll go all the way from ancient Greece through Rome, through a little bit of the medieval period, through the Enlightenment to now. And what we're going to find is that instead of being designed, like nowadays, everything's kind of designed towards like this worker mentality. It wants like obedient workers and consumers. It doesn't really appeal too much to an individual thinker, especially just like public school, right? It's this one size fits all approach. If you're in, like, let's just say you're in high school, you're forced to take some form of algebra. And most people, once they graduate, they'll never use algebra in their life. Even the people who desire to go on to college, the only reason why they'll pay attention in the algebra or take it seriously is to pass the class later on in college whenever they have to. And you have this same thing that happens with a lot of different things in school, just the motivations being there. We'll get into a little bit of psychology behind that, but everybody notices it all the way down to like the baseline, just like normal person that don't really care or think about anything besides just like their job and whatnot. They don't really care too much. But we'll actually, unlike the Tates and all these red pill figures, we'll give definitions to how this stuff came to be. You also have within modern schooling this root in like secular materialism, which is just like cut off from any sort of religion, any sort of attribute to the truth and divine truth. Everything's kind of relative and subjective, and it really gets to be annoying. And what we'll see once we get into the history of education, going all the way back to Greece, we'll see how there's been a trade-off, a real big trade-off. We like to think, oh, everybody's learning how to read. Everybody's doing this and that, even though the majority of the people aren't reading anything worth anything. They're not going back and reading any of these classical pieces of literature or anything like that. And I'm not trying to be pretentious, but there was this clear understanding in the past. Not everybody has to be a scholar. And nowadays, with modern education or schooling, everybody's forced to have this kind of desire that wasn't necessary in the past. Some people could just be farmers. Some people could just be blacksmiths. Some people could just be artists. You could do some of these things that nowadays, oh no, even the farmer, he has to go to the school or his dad's going to jail. You have this weird dynamic that popped up where when we look into the medieval period, they had guilds where you might not be a nobleman's son, where you're going to go off to like, say, the 12 to 1300s, you're going to go off to Cambridge or Oxford. These universities existed back then. You could go down to the local guild at like 11, get into an apprenticeship with some sort of trade in a guild and work yourself up. So by the time you're 18 years old, instead of, what skills do you got? Oh, I know, I failed algebra, but I kind of know, a little bit. I don't really even know what a noun or an adjective is. I didn't really care. I just kind of did the test, copied a little bit, and passed by. No, you actually gain a trade. And this is how it was set up all the way up until around the 1600s. So we're going to get into that. We're going to get into how schooling is not education. These are two distinct things, okay? Through etymology, I'll show how this is the case, and then towards the end, once we get past all the history of education, you'll truly understand this. Now, true education is something that fosters an independent thought, and it inspires virtues. Your whole goal is to take someone from point A to point B on a personal basis, not just this broad one-size-fits-all, everybody's got the same curriculum, all of this that originated from a lot of French thinkers during the Enlightenment, and we'll really get to all of this. And right here we have Saint Hildegard. She was a Catholic nun, and she basically pioneered a lot of modern music, as you see in like composers and all of that type of more complicated forms of music. Her, and as well as lots of other people within the church, started to develop music as a language on paper, and lots of the modern liturgical songs that you hear in Catholic churches come from her. Lots of the melodies and stuff like that. She started putting them on paper, and you get this developed as a language, and that just originated from a monastery. So we'll get a little bit into monasteries and all of this type of stuff. So first and foremost, education. It's not schooling, okay? It originates from the Latin verb educare, which basically means to bring up, to nourish. And educare meaning to lead forth or to bring out. So in essence, what this is, it's basically just signifying what I already said. Instilling independent personal virtue from the child all the way up into something fully developed. It's not just you shove someone in a classroom and you have this universal curriculum that you think someone is going to benefit society from. No, you teach someone how to think. You teach them all these virtuous things, ethics. We'll get into the Trivium. We'll talk about the Trivium and how you have, within the Trivium, you have grammar, logic, and rhetoric as like very concrete systems. You ingrain these into your brain and you perceive everything from that. Just in the way a Catholic or another religious person will, through this religious worldview, see the world from. It's just another tool to perceive these things. And the word school originates from the word schole in the Greek, which basically just meant leisure, philosophy, lecture place. They're not integrated. Like this original idea in the Latin of education, if I'm not mistaken, it kind of came to be during the 16th century, all kind of culminated. The whole idea is to truly, on an individual basis, educate someone in something that's unique to them, inspiring creativity, inspiring a change of mind, not just, oh, how can this one person be another cog, right? So, next thing I want to instill is you can learn anything, but you need to ask yourself, do you actually want to? We've all ad nauseum at this point heard this rhetoric of you can do anything. There's so many movements online, self-improvement, etc. All these movements that instill this, you can do anything you want, dude. The sky is the limit. All this secular, autonomous philosophy really instills this, but it is true, okay? In Catholic teaching, we believe that everybody's made in the image of God. We believe there is a certain potential for everybody. There's a certain vocation for everybody. And we believe in talent. Now, personally, I feel like there's a kind of a pendulum to talent, if you will. It's not just set in stone, where basically the modern thinking of talent is like you'll see on America's Got Talent or America's Idol, one of these like American singing TV shows. Some like 8-year-old kid will get up there and play the violin like a virtuoso or anything like, or sing opera or something completely unexpected. Talent is real, but within these skills, there is a certain level of tedium that you have to put in a tedious nature. Whenever you say you want to do painting or something, yeah, you're going to have to spend 12, unless you want to just Jackson Pollock spurt paint on the canvas. Say you want to do a level of realism or something like that, you want to attribute to the beauty in the world, you have to spend 12 hours on a drawing. You have to spend multiple days on a painting sometime to get these desired effects. And these things are tedious, and they go amongst all the arts, all the crafts, and all the arts, physical, liberal, fine. We'll get into that in a little bit. But there's been tons of proof. There's been Jesuit priests that go down into South America, and they'll teach a civilization who has no tradition in written language, teach them how to write in 30 hours. You can look this up and find this. Another example is if you've ever seen the movie, I'm blanking on the name now, Stand and Deliver, where there's this Hispanic teacher, right? And he goes down into California. He goes into this ghetto school, and there's all these like gang member students in there, and immigrants that hardly speak English, or just black kids and stuff like that, and it's in the ghetto, and they don't care about any of it. This movie was a real story where this dude, broke several records year after year for the most kids who passed an advanced placement test for calculus. He taught these kids calculus. The movie is really good. I recommend it to anybody. But it's a real thing. I mean, I didn't know this until I started doing research for this video, that was like actually a real thing. And there's several other examples through many fields of this same sort of thing, where you can learn anything. It just comes down to, do you actually want to? That's a big, important thing. There's been several different things that I've done where I get attached to the aesthetics of it. You get attached to the aesthetics of an art, the reverence that the artist receive, or even the idea, as I have here, of like this starving artist, this writer getting down behind his typewriter and creating Blood Meridian or some masterpiece, right? You get attached to these ideals, but then whenever you actually go to do it, you might write a little bit. Then the next day, I don't really know. Then before you know it, you haven't done it for a week. Then you go back into it. You realize how tedious it is, and you get in this cycle. But then there are some things that you do, and whenever you even just first do them, it's just this instant pull into the craft, and you love every aspect of it. You like the tactile function of the brush on the canvas. It's almost like this serene quality where it's just no thoughts, just that whole flow state ideology, right? Lots of people, creative types, worship that flow state. You get into this zone or whatever. Many different things, right? But you really need to understand that you can do anything, but do you really want to? Now, let's get into the history of education, right? So we're going to start with the Greeks. We'll touch a little bit on the Romans, and it's going to be brief. I just want to set this narrative right away. So in Greece, they had a specific system that emphasized philosophy, rhetoric. They trained in gymnasiums. You see lots of the statues back then where the anatomy was just like shredded, just ripped and everything like that. That was because they actually put an emphasis on physical training within their curriculum, you could call it that. But it wasn't exactly for everybody. You know, you had a choice. We'll see this same pattern all the way starting back from Greece, and you can even go to Mesopotamia, you can go to Egypt with this. But you see this pattern where, wait, you're telling me all the kids weren't forced to go to some sort of school where their parents would go to jail if they didn't show up and learn algebra? Really? That kind of sounds a little bit more freeing. They had a choice. Well, they might not have been born into a rich family, and if they had the interest of, let's say, some sort of scholarly pursuit, they wanted to read through all these books or learn all this stuff, and they didn't have the money, they might not have been able to do that. But they wouldn't have been forced into a certain curriculum. They could have joined some sort of local trade at like 12 years old, 10 years old. They could have apprenticed doing these things, and that could have been their life path. It didn't have to be as it is now, most of these people just checking out in high school because they realize how pointless the system is, that you have to do a certain mathematics or a certain science only for the result that you'll get a grade from it and do some state mandated test and all of this. It's not an individual interest thing. And then you move on a little bit, right? Move into Roman education. They had lots of oratory schools, law schools, mainly for elites. It was still this elite-driven system, but there was still the choice there. You look into early Jewish tradition. They had like Torah studies, different ethical, religious systems that they taught the children. Early Christianity is where you start to get a little bit of an expansion, especially with the catechesis and the catechetical schools, right? We still have this today with modern churches, mainly just like Orthodox and Catholic, where you go in and you join a class, and before you can become a member of the church, you have to go through this process of learning the faith. They had the same system back then. You would learn scripture, theology. They would even touch on Greek philosophy. You go and read someone like Augustine. He's talking and referencing all these different philosophies, Neoplatonic, all these different things from hundreds of years prior to him. It was open to converts, this education. It was a first type of education where you could just go into the church. A little restrictive back then. It was almost like a little, not mysterious in the sense of like a cult, but you would have to stay in the nave of the church or the building. You couldn't go sit amongst the congregation because you weren't a member yet. You had to learn. It was this process of opening yourself up to it. They had faced a lot of persecution. Everybody knows about this in the early church. And there was also some literacy requirements. That was why most of these things, from Greek to Roman, all these schools were kind of reserved for the elites, is because you did have to read. And throughout most of history, that is the major requirement. That is the one benefit of today, is that basically everybody knows how to read if they go to school. But do they really? I don't know how many people, myself included, when I first graduated, didn't even know what like a preposition was, or a noun, or not probably a noun, but like an adjective, or little bit of a complicated, what is syntax? Any of these different things. Explain certain grammatical concepts. You don't really understand them. It's just kind of intuitive into you. So you don't actually have any ability to take it a step further. So the commonality was, like I said, most of it was allotted to the nobles and required you to read, but the quality of education was a lot more personal, emphasis on instilling individual virtue, and really that definition of education applied the most here, where it's to bring someone up, not to just cookie cutter apply some sort of curriculum, but to individually bring someone up. So then you get into the medieval period, and this is where it starts to really blossom. 5th century all the way to 15th century. That'll be my definition. I'll even include the Renaissance for this slide so we can really go quickly here. But after the Roman Empire, you start to get developments. You get into Charlemagne after around 1800, where after the fall of the Roman Empire, things start to pick back up. You get monasteries, you get cathedral schools, you even get, starting around the 12th century, you start to get universities. Some of the most famous that we have now, Oxford and Cambridge were both founded in the 11 to 1200s, right? Certain things that we're going to touch on later into this video that they mostly taught back then in these schools was this idea of the Trivium and the Quadrivium, right? You would learn how to think using grammar, logic, and rhetoric as an actual concrete system, not some sort of abstract idea. No. I'll explain through several slides how these things function as an actual, almost you could say, tool belt of how you take inputs in, you process them, and you output them into the world. Then they did the quadrivium. I'm kind of thinking about doing a separate video on this. It's very interesting. Arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy. And within these monasteries, it was kind of exclusive to the clergy, nobles, some poor people via their churches did have access to this stuff. The way that the medieval towns would form, as you see right here in this image, and this isn't a super accurate, you can find medieval maps and stuff like that. But the church, the monastery would build in the heart of the town, and everything would develop out around it. And it would just kind of be like this spider web centering in on that place of education, right? Lots of people like to get into the propaganda side that we've been fed about the medieval period of like, oh, they were just like these like power hungry rock stars. I've heard Joe Rogan say that in the past about medieval priests and clergy and stuff like that. But they don't ever talk about the system of which the town literally sprung forth from these monasteries, as well as you get into the Cambridge and all the universities that started popping up around there. But most interestingly, that will serve my point here, is the guild system, right? What is the guild system? I've touched on it in several different presentations, but in the medieval period, they had this system where most of these things were, even in the universities starting off early on, it was mainly certain experts, teachers and whatnot, say some sort of master blacksmith or master leather worker, or you can imagine the types of trades they would have back then. They would start up some sort of guild and start taking on apprentices. And instead of, like you have today, you are forced by law to go to school and learn algebra for the sake of instilling it to where you can go to college and get a credit for it and then actually get to do what you want or get your degree for it. No, you could, at the age of 12, you could go to one of these places, or even younger than that, an apprentice, and you would have a whole career path lined out for you. But we don't have that in our current society. We outsource everything. It's why we're in this predicament of labor crises where the pay to the actual labor being done, there's not a balance between this. But back then, everybody wasn't forced for 12 plus years to go to school and learn something that they weren't interested in by law. There was flexibility within the whole system, right? At the same time, you didn't have to be a scholar. Most were not St. Thomas Aquinas in his monastery cell reading through Aristotle. I mean, that was still there back then. They were not idiots like a lot of people try to paint the medieval period, but there was this level of autonomy, true autonomy, and focus on the individual and virtue and what that individual can do instead of just this cookie-cutter pushing of education, right? And to me, it's a lot more of an interesting system. You see certain schools, right? Well, they will have certain trades. Might have welding in their school. They might have, very few nowadays have carpentry, but they might have that. They might have, you name it, any of these different things. But you're still forced to spend majority of your time on these other pursuits that are not going to be beneficial to that. So that's the medieval period. Now you get into modern education during the Enlightenment, 17th, 18th century. You get this secular shift, right? Before, everything was kind of pivoted on. Probably if I do drink a Monster, my go-to would be the white one, but I'm just kind of a coffee person. But during the Enlightenment, you get this shift in all these monasteries and all these even universities where it was a majority Catholic society. During the Enlightenment, you get this shift from revelation, from divine truth, everything pinpointed on that, to reason. You get certain thinkers like Rousseau with their education for natural man, state loyalty over church loyalty. With Voltaire, he introduces this idea of the skepticism and relativism, and then you even get to Comte with this positivism, which really is how we got to where we are today. It is science as the ultimate truth. It is this idea of scientism, where we put all of our authority and our faith not necessarily on the church, on any of these teachings. We put it on a new set of scholars, these empirical scientists. And this video isn't going to be a big precept or anything like that, but it is something that we have to keep in the back of our mind. While this education was being shifted, you really do get this major change during the Enlightenment. And it's mainly for the state, not the soul. And you get a lot of confusion. I mean, this is where the French Revolution happened, was in the Enlightenment. And all of the major figures who have actual impact over society, right? Your politicians and people like that, they're being influenced by this revolutionary philosophy. The American Revolution is a little bit before the French Revolution, but they basically have lots of trade-offs back and forth. And then in Prussia, which you can think of Prussia as like northern Germany, Germanic peoples, right? In the 19th century, you get a schooling system actually developed. The whole idea of like K through 12, that grading system where you're lopped into certain categories. Whereas in the past, right, I said in the medieval period, you basically, at 12 years old, could go work as an apprentice at some sort of trade shop or anything like that. But you start to get this mandated curriculum. You start getting a lot of control from the state. Like I said a second ago, you can't just be a farmer. You can't just be any of these things. It's this idea of liberty, right? That's the big major philosophy of the Enlightenment, this idea of liberty and freedom. It's actually where you get the Statue of Liberty, right? You see this Statue of Liberty in New York City. It was a gift to the United States, but this whole concept, but whenever you really look into it, it's not true freedom. You're being forced into something completely different than that you had freedom of before, and you're kind of told, yeah, it would be nice to go to school because everybody knows how to read and everybody can do these things, but I mean, just look at the options. You don't really have the freedom to just go and do this, or you're stuck for 12 years, just stuck. So you get this guy, Horace Mann, with this thing called the Boston School Committee, and he was influenced a lot by this Prussian model, which included the age grading, the standardized curriculum. Everybody's just kind of pasted on in this mass model. You think of, there's like that Apple ad, right? You know that 1984 Apple ad where everybody's kind of just staring at this big screen, and then I guess it's the Apple computer person or whatever. The girl runs through there and swings the hammer. That whole idea of that. You get a lot of science fiction novels written at the very end of the 19th century that basically are like predicting our move towards all this like techno transhumanism, like the brain chip and all of that. You start to get this wave of the transhumanism stuff. So you have that. You have the state-funded schools start to happen. Broad access is introduced. This is part of the enticement. This is what you're kind of encouraged for, right? But you have to understand the trade-off is it's not the individual, like all the way back in Greek times, Roman times, right? It's individual virtue, bringing the individual up. It's starting to be mandated as just, no, this is all what you're going to be taught. And then you get to kind of where we are today. And this is where it gets kind of malicious when you look back into the history, especially during the Industrial Revolution, where we get this demand for labor, right? We've all seen in school the pictures of the little kids in the factories and stuff like that, right? Now, there is a connection certain people make where the reason why we have such a dumbed down curriculum that kind of, when we graduate at 18 and we're kind of just like, what the heck do we even do? Like, if we were in a crappy school that didn't actually have some sort of trade or alternative to going to college, most of us are like, what are we supposed to do? That is a direct result of that Industrial Revolution from certain people like Rockefeller and Carnegie, who they funded these reforms. These elites, whenever you hear about the Industrial Revolution, when these big companies with railroads or metal sprung up into these dynasties, and lots of people. I made a video the other day, just going over like 20 different people who, lots of different groups attribute to running the world, right? And one of those that a lot of people talk about are these big, rich American families during the 19th century that just sprung up. Henry Ford, Rockefeller, Carnegie, right? And there's lots of conspiracies surrounding them. But there is actual concrete proof that these people funded these school reforms. And the theory goes that they kind of instilled this certain... Bro, is that Devin? I'm not sure, but that's what my brain goes to with the name. I'm discussing basically this medieval thinking of the Trivium and the Quadrivium, right? It's basically like the medieval curriculum and how they were taught in schools. And I'm briefly going over the history of education to how it got from there to how it is now. And then I'm going to discuss a little bit about how it's important as like a thinking system. So right now, my whole focus has kind of been like dragon. Okay, I got a buddy that's got. I got a buddy that uses that same name. But basically this narrative on how like school systems in the ancient world, they focused on individual virtue. The word education comes from a Latin word that basically meant to bring up. In school, it was kind of more of this word for a lecture place, a place where lots of people go to hear one specific lecture. And that idea, now we kind of correlate school and education together. And then I'm going to touch on a little bit self-education, reading, so on and so forth in a little bit. But in terms of how we got to where we are now, where you go to school and you're forced into certain classes, like some examples I gave was algebra. You have to take certain courses, algebra, or certain foreign language classes that you'll never use. You're forced into these. Like if you don't, in America, if you don't show up to these schools and pass these classes, one, you're stuck. You're forced to completely or just keep repeating them. And if you don't show up, you're like, for one, your parents will go to jail if you don't show up. A cop will come to your house, so on and so forth. And it's required. But in the past, you had this option where you could go into a apprenticeship somewhere, especially in the medieval period. A lot of people don't know that some of the most famous schools like Cambridge and Oxford were founded during the medieval period with this education that I'm going to talk about shortly. And they had options. They didn't have to go to college either. Like the scholarly approach was better back then in terms of individual basis. You look at modern academia and college, everybody thinks it's a scam. Back then it was more individual focused. And then as well as you look at options, you had more options back then in terms of the farmer could just be a farmer, and his son could be a farmer if he wanted to. Life was a lot more simple with a lot more simple choices. So you get with these, with the Industrial Revolution, right? Rockefeller, Carnegie, several other moguls funding these school reforms that influence the curriculum, influence what they are going to be made to study in these schools. And the goal of this, really, with that theory, is you're trying to train compliant workers for these factories. Oh, I guess I'm gonna do the algebra, because if I don't do the algebra, I'm gonna fail. And if I fail, then I can't do it in college and get my credit. And then I don't get a job. It's this same narrative. You're not doing the things for virtue and for individual education. It's purely to be compliant to the system and just kind of help to just run the ringer of the system. And you get the Education Board in 1902, which really standardized this curriculum. And then you get to this progressive movement, right? Where there's this guy named John Dewey, and he has this social reform, and it really starts to focus the schools, again, not on individual virtue, not on individual talents, individual strengths and weaknesses, which we will talk about. I'm going to go over the elite curriculum that you're taught in certain boarding schools, expectations in certain, like, let's just say, what do you think what's the big major mogul British family? What's the one where everybody thinks they run Rothschilds, right? What do the Rothschilds teach their kids in these elite things? Well, spoiler alert, they're all homeschooled by this system of individual focus and virtue, building it up. But it's this shift from this individual style to socialized. You hear this thing, oh, you're going to homeschool your kids? They're not going to be social. They're going to be weird. They're going to be like little hermits. That whole narrative is propaganda, okay? It's propaganda. Most people don't ever think about the individual importance, right? We'll get into how these elite schools instill like a tolerance to certain emotional pain, physical pain, educational pain. We'll get into that. But it's this shift from child-centered to this collectivist approach, this organism. We've got to grow this organism, right? It's dependency on said organism, and it makes people really confused, right? They don't really, there's just this, oh, I don't know what to do. I guess I'll just follow this, right? So then it kind of, as well, disconnects students from family, community. You look back to this medieval period, right? They would basically, your whole community was this idea of how they're kind of pushing this organism, but it was a much more organic organism. Everybody relied on each other. That whole idea that I said where the farmer could be a farmer, he wasn't forced by law to go to school. Well, this blacksmith would get their food from this farmer. This farmer would get all their implements fixed and made by the blacksmith. And all of this stuff being at home and not being 8 hours out at this random school, it kind of played off of each other, right? And it just stifles individuality, stifles the creativity, right? But it gives this false illusion. We see things like Pink Floyd, The Wall, all these social critiques about this system. And but it increases access, right? It's universal. More people have access than ever. You also have some sort of gaps, like poor schools, underfunded. I remember in my school, several classes. I took a class that was supposed to be for web design, and the teacher quit like 3 times, different years. The teacher quit, and I didn't even learn HTML by my senior year, and it was supposed to be like the main thing. And that's a commonality amongst lots of schools, especially like poor schools, where there's just no structure to the actual education. And it really, I mean, We've already covered how there's no individual focus, so they're not going to be like, well, are you actually learning? No, it's just, here's the state-mandated test. Can you pass it? If not, oh well. Right? Why does modern education suck? Well, for one, we have a good amount of Pavlovian conditioning. Pavlov was this psychologist dude, right? And he came up with this idea, and it's best explained in this little diagram right here. You see the dog, he sees the treat, his mouth starts watering and he'll do anything, right? But if you ring a bell, he's like, a bell? Like, what? I don't care, bruh. But you ring the bell and associate it with that food or that treat or that reward psychologically, then he starts to associate that said reward that he already likes with the bell. And this is what you get in this modern school system with the grades and with the passing and everything like that. The reward system is not on an individual basis of like, okay, I have this plan, I know what I want. It's, no, I do this, I cheat, I'll put all my time into this thing I don't even care about just to pass, just to get the reward, just to get the appraisal and stuff like that. But you don't actually get anything out of it. It's just conditioning to kind of, once you go into the real world, be acclimated and all that type of stuff. You get a lot of secularism within it. Collectivism, this idea again of like everybody is this whole organism. There's no individual focused. The whole curriculum is structured around how can we in the most broad way teach instead of individual, right? Completely contradicts education. We have the loss of the absolute truth. In the church-driven medieval period, theology holds that there is an absolute truth. It's what everybody's doing their work for. We all believe in truth. Things are not just this relative, oh, I don't really know. Of course, there's disagreements. But when you start to get, I talked about this in my last video, why the Enlightenment is bad and why it caused so much confusion. Go on TikTok. Actually, delete TikTok. But if you have it, or you have gone on it, which I'm assuming most of us have, what do you see? You see 1,000 ideas, 1,000 perspectives, all in different directions, and it just leaves you scratching your head thinking, what am I supposed to believe? What am I supposed to accept? You go on just take Joe Rogan's podcast for an example. You go on Joe Rogan's podcast and watch it, and it's like 1,000, it's the most popular podcast in the world. And what is it? It's 1,000 perspectives that are just on an infinite horizontal plane. None of them go down vertically. 3 hours, and you're not like nothing that you could take notes on for multiple pages. It's just like 10 minutes on one topic, 10 minutes on another, and there's nothing, but it's the most popular media source because that's how we're conditioned. Who needs 7 classes in a day spread out? It is this curriculum that they're pushing, this just horizontal thinking, right? There's no depth to it at all. And it's because of this push from the Enlightenment. You get these philosophers like Voltaire. You get these Enlightenment thinkers, okay, that push this idea of liberty, true freedom, is getting away from absolute truth and questioning things. All these Enlightenment thinkers are deists. What is a deist? Let me do a little association so you associate these things as I explain them, okay? Think atheist. Atheist, what does that word mean? We all know it means someone who doesn't believe in God, right? Well, atheist. What is a theist? This is someone who believes in a God. Mostly a intervening God. A God that created the world and actually goes and interacts with it. A deist is someone who basically believes that God is way beyond. He's unpersonal and he doesn't intervene into the world, okay? That's a deist. That's what most of these, whenever you hear people say, well, there was Christians during the Enlightenment, there was Christians, most of these thinkers, Descartes, Voltaire, these people were deists. Isaac Newton. People will say, oh, science had this perspective of Christianity. Isaac Newton, if you read his writings, was like Gnostic. He completely believed in deism. It was no way, shape, or form the personal connection that we have within something like Catholicism, or even I'd give credit to Orthodoxy. It's this complete impersonal, just relative, I don't really know anything. Whoa, dude. And you're propagandized to think that's what breeds creativity, that's what breeds progress, is this autonomy overload. Everybody knows how to read, so everything's better. Who's reading? I read a book in 3rd grade, and I didn't read another book all the way through until like 9th grade. And I didn't get into reading until afterwards, and I realized how retarded I was. So these are things that you're just forced to come to terms with. And the best explanation of why things are bad that you get in secular society is Andrew Tate, school's gay, and you don't ever understand why. But this is why. It's because of these loss of absolute truth, installation of revolutionary Enlightenment philosophy, okay? Now, and it's a tool for social engineering. I have these like little placeholder notes here as well. It is an absolute tool for social engineering. You go to any of these schools, some of these schools are teaching gender studies and things that absolutely just kill your time. You have such a small amount of time, and you're going to spend it on these absurd questions. It's just ridiculous, right? Other things, right? You have standardized testing, all of these prison-like structures, limiting of religious perspectives, etc. Whenever the ancient focus was on wisdom and virtue, right? School of Athens. But now you have to kind of unschool yourself. After you graduate, you have to kind of detach yourself from these modes of thinking. So here's where, if you want to take notes, you might want to. So here's some awarenesses to build up, and I'm going to explain elite curriculum, kind of their focus in their schools. So some awarenesses when educating yourself that you want to aspire to is you want to have an understanding of personal reality, right? Relatives, your ancestors. What was their culture? What were their goals? What did they struggle with? What was their history, right? And you want to do this not only because it's good to know those things. You look at cultures like Rome, and they almost, in a heretical way, idolize these things. They took them way too far. They took tradition way too far. But nowadays, it's not a bad thing to kind of instill this, because we've completely, in secular society, lost this idea of tradition. But the more practical reason why you want to build an awareness on personal reality, your relatives, ancestors, you want to take an inventory of certain things, like your weaknesses, your strengths, and certain of these things that derive themselves from said heritage. You want to have a general awareness of a knowledge of history, locally, your town, right, regionally, state, stuff like that, local areas, nationally, country. You want to have a true understanding of that, and global. You want to understand it is a tapestry, and it's been tainted. When you go to these public school systems and the type of history that they teach, it's almost always propagandized. One example, really hearkening to my whole thing with the French Revolution, did you know, or I don't even know whoever listened to this, if you've heard this, but during the French Revolution, Marie Antoinette, there's a famous quote where there's like a mob that's starving, and she basically says, like, let them eat cake. And you see this in movies, you see this in TV shows, not every one, but the ones that focus on this topic. You see this sentiment like, oh, all these French monarchs were just like assholes. They didn't care about anything. They were selfish, just like these weird aristocrats, right? That quote was completely propagandized by the revolutionaries. Okay, you can verify this online. I'm not going to sit here and cite everything I say, but you can verify these things, and that is a very common occurrence. Multiple things propagandized like that to make you see history, and enough of these things get put in front of you, and you see enough of them that people start to distrust that a tapestry could even be formed of history. And that's what you don't want to get to. That's where you start to get into that. That's one way. That's another form of propaganda, is by putting all these things and lies in front of you, they get you to kind of distrust that there is any sort of canon or history to begin with. And then you're kind of just like, oh, well, I guess nothing really is true. And then you're back to the relativism, which goes into nihilism. You think nothing is true. That's the textbook definition of nihilism. If nothing's true, then nothing matters. Then you're just one step away from the revolution on man himself. On, let's put the brain chip in everybody. Let's worship AI. Let's do these things. That's how you get to those points, is from these philosophies. So build an awareness on that. Build an awareness. This isn't as relevant today as it was, say, 25 years ago. But build an awareness of the physical world within reach of you, your little town, your little area, your city. Build relationships with these people. I do my business in my wood shop, so I have a decent relationship with my postal service, UPS store, people like this. Other people in the town that might want work done for them, because I don't just like build little knickknacks. I'll do actual carpentry and fix things for people, like handyman type stuff. Build these relationships. Now, as of today, it's not as relevant as it used to be, right? Because in the past, you didn't have the internet, so that was like basically all you did have. But still, it's a good thing to do and be acquainted with all of that. Next is an awareness of the world at work, the availability of things, how they interact with each other, availability of vocations out there, broaden the horizon, right? You've all heard that. Know a little bit of philosophy and psychology, why you ought to do certain things, learn that, psychology mainly for relationships, intricacies of homemaking. This is a big one, right? Setups, certain ways you want to set up things that you like doing in your home, family dynamics, location of it, even actual homemaking. I would, within the elite system of their education that they study, we will come to find how much they prioritize hands-on experience. If you want to truly educate yourself in this traditional sense of the word, to lift one up through virtue, ask yourself, is it virtuous to spend $600 on a plumber when I could just buy buy a snake or something like that and learn how to just DIY fix my toilet or something like that, as long as you're not having to like dig up pipes and all sorts of things. But a lot of it's super simple. Or putting up a shelf, or just these small little things. Learn how to do it yourself. Learn a little bit about religion, what the different ones believe. You don't have to go into all the in-depth faculties of it, but so you're not caught off guard with something, whatever your worldview and your beliefs are. Be strengthened in that, so you can kind of, one, see everything through it, but two, so you can kind of see how things interact with each other. Now, what is the elite's educational focus, right? Firstly, it's a discipline of mind that knows itself, strengths and weaknesses. You're not going to spend hours and hours doing something that you're just genetically not ever going to be able to do, right? There are certain things that you cut yourself off with within common sense. So that know your strengths and weaknesses. If you're like, want to play basketball or something, whatever, right? And you're 5'4", know your strengths and weaknesses. That's like a super exaggerated analogy, but just know that, right? theory of human nature. That's another thing they study. You study the human nature to avoid being cheated, being fooled, right? Within the Catholic Christian paradigm, what is our theory of human nature? Why are humans the way they are? It stems from Genesis 6. The Nephilim, sons of God, slept with the daughters of man, introduced all sorts of technologies to them. The techne introduced all these things to them, causing corruption, so on and so forth. I'm going to do a video on that alone by itself, because that's super interesting to me, at least. But know the theory of human nature. There's a secular theory. What is the secular theory of human nature? They have this thing called natural rights. Okay, if you're a Catholic, you've heard of natural theology, right? Observing things around you and empirically being able to prove God. The atheists have their own system of that, where it's basically you observe everything around you. We look at animal nature to see what is good and what's bad. They have this whole thing of, I'm blanking on it. It's like an ineptitude towards non-aggression or something right like that, right? Like the drawing towards being non-aggressive, right? There's lots of things. I'm not going to do some precept on that or anything right now, but have that theory of human nature. That's one of their requirements. Another one of the elite educational requirements is that strong history of knowledge. Again, I cannot reiterate that enough. Last year, I went off the wagon with thinking like all this, like, oh, there's no truth, just being completely relative about everything. And I started questioning history. I started questioning that. And it's an infinite death spiral regress that you go into once you accept that. But if you actually read, you go to the sources yourself. I put this in here ironically. I probably wouldn't just pick up like a catch-all world history book. I'd probably look for independent sources on certain events, right? I'm Catholic. We believe in revelation, so the history within Scripture, we believe that to be true. But overall, no matter what your views are, you need to form this tapestry of history and how it interacts with itself. Knowing the origins, this ties in with history. This is the fourth, the origins of political, economic, and legal systems. I just detailed how revolutionary Enlightenment philosophy led to the school system, how this political ideology led to certain things like nihilistic thought, etc. Being educated in certain political systems, this doesn't mean you have to read every single political book ever written. It doesn't mean you have to know top from bottom every single political system there is. It doesn't mean that you have to pass the bar exam whenever it comes to legal systems. It just means a broad general knowledge of the origins of these things. Go read Aristotle's Politics, right? Go read some of these books, Wealth of Nations. But then also, don't be like the normie. Go read the other ones. Go read Mitford Goodson's History of Central Banking. I mean, lots of people hate that book because of what it says in there, and I'll get banned off YouTube if I speak it out. It's about the tiny hats, right? But balance both of them. That's how you build that accurate tapestry, and we'll get into how to discern this stuff with the Trivium, right? Secondly, hands-on experience. The elites prioritize this in their curriculum. Mentors, physical skills. The mentor thing is big. It's really hard if you're into something super niche, right, to find certain mentors. It can be done. Physical skills. I will get into this dichotomy between physical arts, fine arts, transitive, right? Transitive as in interacting in the real world. In liberal arts, these transcendent, intransient things that are based in our mind, philosophy, history, mathematics, okay? Those things are the liberal arts. Not liberal in the sense of, oh, libtard, like not in the sense of that, in the sense of liberating you. And that's the big thing. Within these systems that I outlined in the history of modern education, you get this idea of liberty being turned into something that it wasn't in the past, because they learned all these liberal arts during the medieval period. Next thing that the elites do, they write a lot. Okay? Write a lot. Journals, essays, all these things. 300 words a day. That sounds like a lot, but that's 30 sentences a day. That's like less than a page. That would take you 2 minutes to speak out loud, right? But that's in their curriculum. That's certain things that they do. They even go a step above that, where a lot of them are writing 1,000 words a day. That's about 3 pages. That sounds crazy to someone who is indoctrinated by this modern school system and don't really care, right, to educate themselves. But if you are going off of that original Latin word, right, educare, which means to lift yourself up, not to put yourself in a school box where you're just eyes wide shut watching whatever they want you to learn within the state-mandated curriculum. You've got to look outside. Look at what these elite boarding schools are doing in terms of trying to lift the person up. These people are paying crazy tuitions for their middle schoolers, $100,000+ tuitions. They have lots of hands-on experience. Develop accurate observation. This might be a weird one. What is accurate observation? This would be certain things like drawing, draftsmanship. Be able to take the ideas you have and put them on paper accurately. You don't have to draw like Michelangelo. You don't have to draw like a Renaissance artist. Just be able to sketch the ideas on paper. Scientific knowledge of the sky above, earth below, in between. Again, don't get indoctrinated with anything crazy. Next thing that they have, this is the last one, practicing and handling pain. Here's a fun thing most people don't know. Where does this interest in America for the sports come from? It comes from these English boarding schools, right, in England, to get people to understand that pain isn't really painful. I mean, you cut your arm off, that's different. But just like growing up in education, bringing yourself up, right? Understanding physical, emotional, and educational pain, becoming used to that, right? So that whole American interest in sports actually comes from that, putting their kids in sports to desensitize them to these things. It's in the medieval world, it's a God-given resource to overcome these things. But within these systems, it's just like developing an internal system to overcome said different pains, right? Determination. And then the last thing is determination to the highest quality of performance for yourself, okay? That means if you're going to teach yourself, this again is the elite curriculum in these boarding schools, their expectations. But if you're going to teach yourself this stuff on your own, you have to truly have those things. You see all the cringy hustle podcasts, right? Where it's like, you're gonna die one day, bro. Marcus Aurelius paid somebody to walk behind him and say, memento mori, memento mori. You know all those cringy hustle podcasts, right? You kind of do have to adopt that philosophy when you're doing this on yourself, because if you set a baseline that you can just easily pass, you're not going to be growing, right? You have to have some sort of progressive overload, per se, where you hit a threshold and you raise the bar and keep raising the bar. So there's that. Now that we've really split the seam from school to self-education, let's talk about different resources. Books versus the internet as resources, right? So certain things right? Lots of people know how to read. I've touched on that. That's the take that you have within modern education, everybody knows how to read. We got to ask the question, what material are they reading, and are they really reading? Most people I know in real life, out of all family, friends, etc., they're not reading a book, right? They're not reading a book every week, even. They're not reading a book every month. They might be reading a book a year, okay? Most people are just consuming media, but if we are serious about educating ourselves in this sense of that word, to raise yourself up, educare, if we are interested in that, we have to go to the source. Going to the source is best. I put all these images because these are very useful. These online resources. Right here I have, this is anybody wants to know about like old Western canon from Homer, Iliad and the Odyssey, to Virgil, the Aeneid, all the way through the medieval period of literature, up until like Milton's Paradise Lost, Jane Austen, right, Pride and Prejudice. If you're interested in that, this is a homeschooling curriculum. And what's up, Sean? Hey, I'm trying, bro. I hope. But this is basic. I discovered this a while back, but it's a curriculum for homeschool. It's like $1,000. It's a lot. A lot of this homeschool curriculum stuff is expensive. Technically, it's going to be launched soon. But technically, it's like you get a lot. Like they'll send you a box of like 20 books, 20 plus books, which if you've ever seen those like $1,000 Harvard classic sets, it's like that. They send you books like that. They send you all these lectures and DVDs. And this is only on that Western canon, right? This is only on like the classics of literature. This isn't a philosophy course. This isn't a whatever niche interest. This isn't a artistic painting course or anything like that. But it's there. And then you have all this free medium. I put this here. I don't know if anybody who's religious, maybe you, Sean, you've seen this, but this Bible channel, they have like, it's the Protestant books, so it's only 66 books, but they basically have like these 8-minute videos of the meat and potatoes, if you will, of that Bible book. So Exodus, see, they'll like start out, they'll have like chapter by chapter, how it goes. That's one form of education. There's also like several other free Bible studies online. Latin, I'm trying to learn Latin right now. There's several people that's got thousands of, even that, you can find everything in PDF form too. I spend a lot of my time reading like printed out essays and stuff. I'll go on, find an essay from like a book of a collection, edit out where the page starts and where it stops and print that out and read it, because I don't want to spend thousands of dollars on these books either. But you just have beautiful resources in these things. This one, if you're into music, any of you, has been one of my favorites lately. Leonard, something like that. It's a tiny hat name. But he was like one of the most famous composers of the last 100 years. And he has this 6-part series on a Harvard lectures from like the 80s where he discusses music theory, but he breaks it down like grammatically. Like he has like an episode on phonology where he talks about like the beginnings of language as like the first music, as like the first universal language. Then he goes into syntax, etc., etc. It's super interesting. You have the Thomistic Institute with all their short little videos, etc. But I mentioned this last video. You want to start easy with easy books. You work your way up. There's some parts of the Summa that like a child could read. They're not like, oh my God, what is an essay? What is all these words? What's all this stuff? No, there's very easy, digestible chunks. And then you work your way up. You work your way up to the metaphysics. You work your way up to things like Dostoevsky. I mean, I tried to read whenever I first started getting into reading. I watched like 5 Peterson videos where he's just like, Dostoevsky is the greatest mind I've ever read. Oh, like they were all them in those podcasts. This was like 4 or 5 years ago. So I bought the Brothers Karamazov, and I bought a really crappy translation, and I started trying to read it. And oh my God, it was so hard. I got like probably 80 pages in, and all the characters just started coming out, and I couldn't follow it, and I gave up. But I went to reading the Game of Thrones after that, which was kind of a waste of time because they're never going to come out. Everybody knows he's never going to finish that. And then eventually you get to the point where you work your way through a lot of that literature, and you start like getting into translating old texts that are in Latin, that are in Greek, that nobody has translated, or they want like $50 for their Amazon copy of their translation or whatever. So there's that. But always, these are great, but going to the source, the books are the best. Okay. Next, teaching back what you know. What am I doing right now? I made this little slide, got real big into the Trivium. All I'm doing is teaching back what I know. It ingrains into you what you know. Another thing that I do besides watching or making videos or anything like that is the whole mini essay thing. I have Obsidian on my laptop, and I'll go on there and I'll just write, like, let's say there'll be a topic or whatever. I'll write out a little like mini essay, less than 1,000 words, and I'll just go until I get bored and stop it. The most famous minds in all of history wrote in journals. Da Vinci's journal and Einstein's journal is here. Again, it just ingrains that knowledge when you take these notes, whenever you do these things. Another thing that I've noticed through making videos, I did have 300 and something videos on my channel, but ended up deleting like a lot of them. But what you'll do whenever you attach yourself to a topic and start trying to riff off about it in video format is you'll have the narrative, but then sometimes, like if you're not reading off of a script, right? This is what I mean. You'll start to riff and go off into these little like riffs, you could just say, or tangents, most people would call it, yapping. And you'll start to say all these analogies and things that really start to just like ingrain it into you. And it's so helpful. I mean, most of like my older videos were just like simple self-help book level information, but it kind of just like all those ideas are still like I can just like easily reference them in my own mind because of how ingrained they are. So there's that. Next is this big distinction we need to make before we get into the Trivium. Practical arts are things like carpentry, medicine, plumbing, business, law, I wrote that twice, etc. It's these transitive skills. Same thing with fine arts, like literature, sculpture, literature in the sense of like sitting down to write like a novel, like Blood Meridian or something like that. Drama, painting, music. These are transitive. I explained this earlier in the video, but it's technical skills we need to interact with things within the world, okay? Right? Liberal arts, on the other hand, which have for the most part been lost in public education, are things like philosophy, theology, math, science, history, etc. They're intransitive, which means that your focus is not on changing or interacting physically with the world, but changing our minds and how we see the world. Okay? Again, I'm trying to keep this narrative of that distinction of the word education, right? Of the word educare, to bring up. It is a individual focused system to instill virtue, not to mass propagandize you in some sort of government mandated curriculum that you're doing, like I said earlier, off of like Pavlovian conditioning, where you're just like, okay, fine, I'll pass algebra because it'll mean I'll be able to get a GPA and go to the college, and I'll just do the thing I hate, I guess. No, it's like individual care. And we really need to understand that. So many people will just ignorantly say, oh, no, bro, modern education's so good because we can read, dude. No, you have no choice. The farmer cannot be the farmer. You cannot just go at 12 years old into an apprentice, and that's your life. You have to go into the school system or your parents go to jail. I mean, it's crazy. So let's get into the trivium. How to think. I know it says what right here, but it's not me saying what you should think, okay? But it's a system on how you think. What just happens to be a category you can reference for yourself. So the trivium is very beautiful, right? It is basically grammar, logic, and rhetoric in this beautiful orchestrated system where you have inputs, you have a processing, and you have an output. You can also attribute this to knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. Or, as I recently have seen it attributed, metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. Ethics, how we should interact within the world. There's your how right there. See how these things start to link together? So grammar. What is grammar? Knowledge, input, metaphysics. Again, not lumping all metaphysics as grammar, but it's a cool, kind of fun association to have, right? It's foundational for learning. It's you're mastering language. You're mastering the structure of said language. There is a grammar for... Yeah, I touched on that a little bit earlier, and I went over briefly from Greece and lots of ancient schools all the way to the Enlightenment into the Prussian stuff. Briefly, I went into that, but and then you get I went into a little bit further how you get into the 20th century with the Rockefeller, or a little bit earlier than that. You get into the Rockefeller and the Carnegie stuff where they actually finance school reform, and it was all for that kind of just 1984 conditioning where everybody is going to be pushed on this thing that they don't care about, so they don't really care about anything. Everything's just kind of relative, and then they're just kind of like cattle funneled into the factory, funneled into the dummy job, funneled into, like you said, soldiers. Really, I mean, that was the start of the idea, is the soldier whenever war was so prominent as an economic system for a society. But then you get a little bit further, starts to become... This is how I like to think about it, right? Secular society, Enlightenment thinking, if you will, they don't have God as their grounding, as their transcendent truth. So they have to have some sort of transcendent truth. So what they do is they start out where they have, let's make everything explained by economics, right? Let's put everything on economics. Then they go from economics to basically physics. They're like, let's just put all of our truths. You get into the 17th century. Let's put all of our stuff into physics and scientism, right? And then from there, that kind of gets dismantled. Then you go, okay, let's put it into biology. And that's where you are now. It went from economics being the main focus of secular world to physics to what you have now, biology. All the just major focus on nothing matters, everything's relative, transhumanism, Darwinism just pushed down your throat. That's really the main focus of it all. But into grammar, we have certain components. We have syntax. These are the sentence structure rules, right? You see this most in Latin grammar. It's honestly kind of fun when you get into Latin, when you get into the declensions, right? I mean, it's a lot to memorize. A lot of people are against that method of learning Latin, but just the syntax, you have the 8 parts of speech for English or most languages. You have your nouns, your verbs, adverbs, prepositions, etc., etc., etc. That's your syntax. Then you have phonology. That's your sound systems. This is also really interesting. In that Bernstein lecture, he talks about how within music we have the first, or within language universally, we have the word ma. Whenever he shows how in like all these different languages, like he showed like over 12 languages, old languages, if you will. Latin, I mean, mater, right? And then you get into Greek, you get into French, you get into all these different languages. This root word, ma, stems, and it's kind of the way he explains it is like he's a secular Jew. So he gives the evolutionary side of it, but it's still kind of interesting to think about. Whenever the baby, whatever he says back in the Ice Age, whatever he says, they're trying to call their mom, and the first thing they can say is, ma, and that's the phonology, right? That's how it explains the phonology coming to be. So you have that. That's just sound systems. Sentences. These are how we craft these coherent ideas. If you want to know about sentences, look up diagramming sentences. Okay, what is diagramming sentences? It's basically like, say this. Look at this right here. Grounds, knowledge, and realities order. This is a sentence. So what I would do is, with subjects and objects, I'm going to split them off. So you would take grounds, knowledge, and you would split that. And it's complicated. There's a whole like art. People do it for fun, but there's lots of complexities to this. And I'm just trying to paint the vastness of the first part of the Trivium, grammar. And you can really, if you follow as I'm describing the Trivium as a Catholic, but as a desired mode of thinking for all people, right? Think of it as inputs. This is your first step of inputs. Then we have logic, right? I touched on this a little bit in my last live stream. Think of this as processing. This is where the input goes in and it's processing. What is it processing through? Well, we have logic. It's not just, lots of people think of logic as argumentation whenever you're like arguing with friends, family, whatever. You're just like, be logical, or even like someone you don't know. Be logical, dude. Use logic. Use reason. I only care about facts and logic. Blah, blah, blah. Like all that, that's what we identify most people until they like deep dive into logic. And then you get into absurdity. Whenever you get into like people like Bertrand Russell, this is what he devised logic into in the Principia Mathematica. This is basically what his system diverged into, where he basically combined logic in mathematical forms and he merged them together. And you get into a lot of the early 20th century people. Gödel, you've heard of Gödel's theorem formula, how he like proves God with, and you see all these symbols. That's a form of this mathematical formal logic. But logic in itself, you have formal and informal. Whenever you really are focusing on trivium thinking, as I'm describing it, you're focusing on informal and deductive logic, right? But for the sake of just explaining the depths, formal logic goes into inductive thought, okay? This is where you get analogy, generalization, different methods for inquiry, right? This can get pretty complicated in itself, but also with Aristotle, you get into the syllogisms, and what I'm really getting at, I'm trying my hardest not to like nerd and deep dive into this stuff because I gotta keep this going, but it has so much depth to plumb through that it's not just goes in your brain, input, grammar, think about it like how you normally do, and you exit it out. No. we have what's called logical fallacies. You see a lot of these online debaters who are like experts in logical fallacies, and it gets annoying to us, right? It gets annoying to us. Some certain people where you're like, ad hominem, nope, that's a false dichotomy, that's a this or that. All these different analogies these people throw out, but they're so important. Okay, they're so important because if you can memorize like the most used, the most important logical fallacies as a form of processing, you memorize the three laws of logic and you have a general understanding. Like, you can go as far as you want to like have like charts up on your wall of like formal logic going all the way down with all these things to plug in your stuff, right? You could even go as far to get into like the Bertrand Russell type stuff. I haven't gone there yet, but just know that it is on the surface level. You can memorize all of these different fallacies. You can understand the syllogism. You can understand the 10 categories as it kind of organizes reality for understanding, right? And kind of connect it as a form of your working practical epistemology. And then from there, we go into rhetoric, right? I put St. Augustine up here. When you read Confessions, he talks about how he was a teacher, like a rhetorician, I think you'd call it. He taught how to be an orator and speak and teach and so forth because that was so big back in that world. But rhetoric, in my opinion, and through this system, is not only, as a lot of people think of it, some form of manipulative persuasion or thought. It is, as I've defined here, the art of applying knowledge wisely through communication and action. And the reason why you have to think of action here is because I'm tying ethics in with rhetoric. What is ethics? It's how we ought to interact with the world. How, okay? How ought. We use speech, writing to influence, to inspire others, right? You also have what's called the three appeals of rhetoric. You have the ethos, which is your credibility of you as an individual, right? You have your pathos, emotion. This is how you kind of emotionally act and inspire emotion. Then you have your logos, which is the reason. And basically, at this point, you've combined grammar's facts and you've used logical reasoning and you've pushed it all into ethical action, right? This is different than secular society. Secular rhetoric manipulates, as I've already said. You hear, there's a quote from Teddy Roosevelt, right, where he talks about rhetoric as like some malicious, manipulative thing. But that's just because it lacks the transcendent truth. There is no pinpoint truth that they had in ancient period. I want to do a video about, I don't know who would even be interested in it, but I want to do a video on, I've been really battling this, on natural theology, and if it really led to the secular natural rights, how they justify their ethics, because I've been drawn so much to the logical arguments of the presuppositional stuff. And it's not that I don't think you can do natural theology or that it's bad. It's mainly just the fact that, like, when you when you see certain people like Jay Dyer and stuff like that, it's easy to get offended when they'll point certain like things out within the faith and say how Catholicism is wrong. But like when you look at their critiques, they're like genuine critiques, not when they're being kind of ingenuine and just like not really sincere and they're trying to jab and poke fun. They'll say certain like heretical things like Abu Aquinas and all sorts of just like ridiculous stuff like that. But what they're doing with the precept stuff is David Hume, during the Enlightenment, he had his is-ought fallacy, right? So what he's doing is he's looking at the writings of St. Thomas in the natural theology, five causes, etc., right? And he's asking the question, you say this is the case, but why ought I do it? What's the justification? And that's what J. Dyer is doing, is he is taking that Humean question posed to the scholastics, and he himself is re-engineered it and pushed it back to the atheists. So it's like, I mean, this is how philosophy works as the 2,000-year dialogue, but you have scholasticism, you have the Enlightenment thinking of David Hume, you have him read Aquinas, you have him ask this question, okay, you observe all these things, we have natural rights. We say that we observe these ethical things in nature, that we think that's a justification. And it kind of is just a back and forth. It's a regress. There's nothing about epistemic justification within that natural theology, right? But then you go forward, and that's the main accusation. The main accusation is that thought, how within natural theology, it's just observing the outside world as evidence. That is the orthobro claim, is that pivoted into secular empiricism, where what do? They observe the outside world. That is what natural rights is. It is that through empiricism, we can observe an observation. We can observe the outside world for what are our ethics. And once that question is posed, if we're going to be genuine, like we're not going to just like outright ignore it like I see certain people do. I've asked certain people within the Catholic space online who are much more scholarly on this stuff than I am, and they don't ever respond. They act like the atheists do, or they just think it's nothing that needs to be answered. But in my mind, it's one of the most important questions. I mean, especially if we're going off this paradigm here, right? We want to truly be faith and reason. We have to balance those, right? So there's that. I'm thinking about making a video on that question. But back to this. The secular rhetoric manipulates, and it lacks that transcendent truth. But one last thing I'll say on that. My video is kind of going to be focused on how like Catholics do have that presupposition of transcendental truth. And they kind of I'll have to check that out, because I don't think I've gone too in depth into that. I'm still kind of like new to a lot of the scholasticism, because a lot of my journey into Christianity was being convinced, was like absorbing all this philosophy and then being convinced by the precept stuff and then being kind of underwhelmed by a lot of it, and then transitioning into the Catholic approach. But I mean, you make a good point with that, because when like the way these ortho bros pose their stuff is it's basically, oh no, this is the entire Catholic paradigm. St. Thomas is all Catholicism is, or all of Catholicism is the Summa. That's all it is. That's like kind of the narrative that you get. And then they start to try to play these games. Like they'll accuse us of being sophists, playing word games, which I have seen certain Catholic apologists do in arguments with these people. They will try to like he'll pull up, I saw one in particular, he'll pull up the Second Vatican Council, the part where it's like Muslims adore the one God, right? And then he'll go back to the Council of Vienne, and he'll show the part in that where they basically said that it's just like a no tolerance policy. And he'll show all these things, and the Catholic apologists will basically just be like, oh no, bro, that doesn't actually mean that. It can mean like they think they do. Again, to me, when I look at that, that is kind of sophistry. I mean, it is clear as day. I believe that the Catholic Church is much more of an organism, breathing, living organism, than the petrified Orthodox Church. That's what kind of brought me into it. I would never transition over, but there are lots of questionable little things like that. But no, I'll have to look into that for sure, because I don't think I've touched it all. All my experience within most theology has come down to, I heard early on, like whenever I first got into it, like the importance of asceticism and mystical theology. So that was the first thing I dove into, is like how to live that ascetical life. And I read a couple manuals about it. I got a little bit into Aquinas. Then I got a little bit into Scotus, and I bounced back and forth. But that's about all, really. Mainly, I just read, and recently just been reading a lot into the philosophy and stuff. But within this rhetoric, true rhetoric serves Christ's mission, and it guides others to God. That's that twofold part. We're serving through vocation, and we're also, through our vocal and written rhetoric, guiding others to God. Output and tangible acts, okay? Ethical deeds. Now, last little slide before I get off of here. Within a worldview, you need to have a voice. I'll tell one little story real quick. I got real big into the occult before I had anything to do with Christianity. I worshipped creativity. Looking back now, within my paradigm, where it's like, well, of course creativity is explained. We're made in the image of the Creator, right? You get into this stuff, and there's a super interesting Socratic dialogue. I don't know if y'all have read Ion, right? It's basically this character Ion and Socrates go back and forth, and Socrates poses this, he puts this forth, that the artists, this is all the way back in ancient Greece, right? The artists, the people in drama, the people in literature, poetry for them, because they were into all the epic poems and stuff like that. Poetry, musicians, they had the lyre and the harp back then. These artists are completely separated from, and again, I defined artists as in fine art, transient, interacting physically, right? They're completely separate from, he didn't use these words back then, but from the liberal art-focused people that are in the philosophers, right? And this was his separation. He said that these artists are basically in, and think of a vessel for some sort of divine influence. You can think of the muse. If you, most people, if you know anything about history, you understand the concept of the muse. These Greek and Roman artists, pagan artists, right? They would call upon Lady Muse. And even nowadays, you get into certain secular writing. There's a book, War on Art, okay, by this guy named Stephen, or what is it? Stephen something. He's been on Rogan. He's came out in the 90s or something. I watched podcasts with him whenever I was into all that occult stuff. But it's not an overtly occult book. It's basically a super simple message. It's just treat art like it's a blue-collar job. That sort of narrative. But he says, he's oh, by the way, blue-collar, practical information, blah, 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 blah. Whenever I sit down at my typewriter, I call upon the divine muse to come into me. And him and Joe Rogan are like, wow, really, really? And then they get back into the practical bits of his book, War on Art. It's just like, quit being a pussy artist and work. Like how most of these like expressionist artist types are. It's just like, dude, treat your stuff like how the Renaissance workshop people did, like a trade. So it was that type of stuff. This Socratic dialogue, 2,000 plus years ago, was basically Socrates telling this character of Ion. That's what these artists are doing. They are influenced as a vessel by some sort of entity. What the liberal arts, philosophy, theology, what we are doing is completely going into reason in our minds, in our just through the intellect, right? And they had their own Hellenistic concept of logos. It was impersonal, but it was like something to tether rationality to. He made this division. And it was so interesting because I fast forward all the way to when I was in this occult creativity worship, and I would watch thousands of episodes of Rick Rubin. And what I was watching was he had this podcast. Rick Rubin is like, I was so obsessed with this shit. I even made like a painting of him at one point. Just insane. But basically, he has this whole thing where he talks super just subliminally. He wrote a book, Manifesto on Creativity. It's basically like a Zen Alan Watts-like book, but it's all about creative process. It's kind of insightful in some aspects, but it has a monad symbol on the front, circle with a dot in it, and he's like, I don't know where that came from, bro. And he goes on these podcasts, and he's like, all art is an offering to God. It's like most profound stuff I heard when I was a creative. I was like, oh my God, bro, that's really what I'm doing. No assumption of what God. Maybe it's Lucifer. No assumption of what God. But he had this narrative. And then I watched hundreds of these podcasts of him with every artist, from Beatles to Lenny Kravitz to, I mean, you literally name it. It was every single rock, pop musician of the last 100 years he interviewed, and they all talked about this muse, not verbatim, like they might have not have all used the word muse, but they talked about this divine influence where I get into my studio. I built like a $10,000 studio because I was so influenced by this stuff. I spent like all my free money and time because I was so interested in this art. Now I kind of have it as like a view of like St. John Paul II. He wrote his encyclical, To Artists, as it's called, where he talks about art as a vocation to promote beauty. That's more of my ideals on it now. But looking back at this Rick Rubin stuff, all these people are talking about being influenced by this weird, unnameable entity that possesses them. And when I've already went over in a couple streams like lyrics from these songs, and they're just like love letters to Satan. Like you read some of these lyrics in these pop songs, and they're just like, I need you more now than ever, I love you, and it's like not even a person. Like they're like demonically influenced. You watch these music videos, they're like, we all know Travis Scott. There's like some weird malicious nature with that weird stuff. He's like has so many Bible euphemisms. I remember I watched his Antidote music video years ago. He's literally reading the book of Psalms in it. It's like a split second, but he reads the book of Psalms, and then he goes on to talk about popping pills is all he knows. It's this weird dichotomy. We already talked in the last stream about System of a Down. They create this unique, like I'm super big right now into composing, trying to like learn how to read music and all this different stuff. And from that perspective, I can say that like System of a Down has like a truly unique, beautiful sound compositionally. But when you get into their lyrics, and it's like mocking the Lord's words on the cross, why have you forsaken me? All like literally quoting his words and then screaming these just like absurdities that kind of are like an inflection of the word self-righteous suicide. I mean, you can go. I mean, I might even do a stream if anybody's interested in this of this musical analysis. Lots of these people in this space do like the psyop movie analysis. I'll do one in the music analysis because that's more my domain. But who are they in? Who are they bringing into their body to make this weird shit? I mean, they literally say like, I don't know where the lyrics came from. I don't know any of this. And then you look deeper. Why does the Beatles and Sgt. Pepper's have a picture of Aleister Crowley on the album cover? Why was Jimi Hendrix, John Lennon? I mean, I could literally list like probably 10 names right now. David Bowie. Why were all these people influenced by Aleister Crowley, the dude who was literally, he's famous for butt sex magic. It's insane. It's literally insane. But, I mean, that's a whole thing for itself. But you wouldn't be able to, I wasn't able until, this is what we get a concrete understanding. I was not able to discern the absurdities in this relativistic worldview that I had held for so long, and just being nihilistic without even knowing it. Oh, I got purpose. My purpose is to just, I had this phrase. It was finish in my music stuff. Finish it, release it, start over. I have purpose because my purpose is creating as many creations as I can because I'm a creator and not a consumer. That's nihilistic modern purpose. It's not true divine vocational let's become saints. It's not that purpose. It is literally just this subjective, weird, demonically influenced society. It's wild. And unless you know these things, educate yourself on this right here that I went over earlier. Use the Trivium as a system to think and learn. Develop a true worldview. Have a goal or a purpose for said education, vocation, primarily, idealistically, religious based, Catholic based, something reaching for the divine, not just like, let me put another pinch of pepper in the cesspool like I was doing. Do that. You got to remain disciplined, and no matter what faith you follow, none of the philosophy or the theology or the literature or the aesthetics matter without the ascetical life. I mean, that's the whole meat and potatoes right there. So many people, and I'm guilty of this, get into this stuff and prioritize the facts and logic, dude, the philosophies and the theology side of these things, and they just ignore the asceticism like it's not the most important thing and the whole purpose of it to begin with. So there's that. Read the classics and the canon and write a lot. One last thing. I'm going to link these two things in the description. First thing I'm going to link to is from this channel called Labyrinth. Now, he's kind of like I wouldn't classify him as Gnostic. I would say he's more of like a deist scholar. He's one of those people, okay? He's one of those like, God it has to exist, but we can never know him. And he'll like put all this stuff. He has like a 25-part series YouTube course for free on the Trivium. It goes over grammar. It goes over a couple things of rhetoric. And then it's like 20 things of logic without getting super deep into the weeds. And it's really good. I mean, I've been consuming it off and on. Right now I'm trying to balance. I'm rereading through the Republic and trying to take notes on it. I want to make a video about it sometime. And I've got several other projects that I'm trying to get through, but I've incorporated that into my daily studies. They're like 25, 30-minute courses, and he's a great teacher. I mean, the way he has his, it's a lot more professional than my slideshow and like little camera. He has like a whole setup and whiteboard and whatnot. But that, and then I don't know if anybody's aware of the artist or the writer, Roger, what is his name? He wrote The Watchmen. He looks like a wizard. He has a big gray beard, long hair, and he wears like 10 rings on his fingers. And he's real big into the occult. But he has this video from like 8 years ago where he's, or even longer than that, early internet video, where he's talking about writing. He's talking about writing as magic, and it's not, I wouldn't recommend it for the necessity of like that. Like, of course, that's divination, that's heretical. But what I say is it gives you a perspective to see. It's like 10 minutes, but it's the best explanation of how these modern artists think. Of like, oh wow, what I'm doing is like magical. He portrays it in like a super like structured way. He'll bring up like certain ideals of consciousness, like Plato's forms, etc. He'll bring up certain ideals that you can attribute with and understand it a lot better than just like my little metaphors. But that's truly what these people think they're doing. They think that writing comes from some sort of archaic shamanism, right? Cave paintings. And from that point on, through these grammatical concepts, we've been casting spells through syntax, symbols, right? And like he's a writer. He wrote The Watchmen, that comic book that turned into a movie with like Rorschach, with the guy with the mask that moves and all the weird dystopian superheroes. Pretty interesting stuff, but like watching him describe it, you'll really get a thing. So I'm going to put that into the description, and I'll put that 20-piece series on the Quadrivium. Well, yeah, I mean, it's like what St. Thomas said at the end of his life, where he basically looks over everything he's ever written and done, and he's just like, it was all for nothing. Because at the end of the day, we can philosophize and theorize and all these different things, but if we're not moving towards the beatific vision, if we're not moving towards becoming saints, it's all for nothing. We are supposed to change the world outwardly, just as in when we receive the sacraments and we become that tabernacle that interacts with the world, Christ through us. It's that same thing. If you're not, like, people will pray, and like people will pray 3 times a day, and they'll say a rosary, they'll do morning and evening prayers, but it'll just be like a machine gun spitting it out. There's no clinging. Like if you sit down and say 3 Hail Marys and 1 Our Father, and you actually are just like focused on the transcendent nature of that prayer, it's 10 times better than all that extra fluff. I mean, it just adds. I mean, it defeats the purpose of what you're doing. You're just muddling words. Now, there is a time and a place for chant. There's a time and a place for like that repetition and whatnot. I'm a big fan of the Eastern Lord's Prayer, or the Jesus Prayer, right? But again, well, I mean, I'm not gonna hate on it. I whenever I was working construction, I would use that a lot as like this almost like mantra to get myself focused on that ascetical life while I'm working, doing all these difficult things that I hated doing at certain periods, kind of just shifting my mind into that servile mindset of like, no, I'm not here to like, I'm here to serve and help these people. It kind of, there's a time and a place for that, and it is one aspect. But a lot of people, they misunderstand it. And Yeah, that's like one of the main things that I don't understand Protestantism at all. It's like, what do they think? Like, they just think like they're like Jedis. Like, that's literally what Protestants think they are. Is they think that they're like Jedis contacting some abstract force entity that's like just out there, and they just say a couple things. A couple things happened and whatnot. I've met Protestants that are filled with the Holy Spirit. Don't get me wrong. Some of these old grandmas in this small town that I live in, but it's like that same mentality. It's the mentality of the self, of the anthropocentric view of, oh, heaven is me, my family, my dog, and we're all on a cloud with the golden streets and all this, whatever they said in the Baptist churches, right? Whenever it's like, no, we're radiating in worship around the world, around the Lord, participating in the nature. Like, it's such, when you understand that, just even understanding that separation between the idea of heaven and the idea of hell within the Catholic worldview, or even the Orthodox to some extent. I mean, they don't believe in purgatory, so they're wrong there. But when you understand these more like apostolic views or ancient views, traditional views of it, compared to like this weird, newly, yeah, dude, it's just like, it breeds this new flavor of Christianity that's so prominent. The occult, weirdly occultic Christianity, where it's just like, yeah, bro, I just like pray. Also, Jesus was from India and he was a hippie and all these, just like, where how that spirals into that nonsense. That Protestantism breeds that, and they don't ever talk about theosis or any of these ideas. Their whole focus is on acquiring some sort of literal occult interpretation of the faith while claiming to be and portraying themselves to naive people to be the more mystical path, when it's like, bro, you read one of these old manuals on mystical theology. That is crazy. And I've said this in so many of my videos. Like, yeah, I mean, that's one thing that I hope to do with these talks, is I don't want it to be a completely selfish endeavor where I'm just like on here trying to ingrain this information to myself. I want to get more into like getting my stuff out there and kind of putting these perspectives, because it's just such a cesspool on there. I mean, you have certain Catholic figures who have like their little niche communities carved out and whatnot, but they don't really push. And it's like I'm educating myself, so I'm like equipped, but we as Catholics really have to understand that verse of the gates not prevailing, right? We are on the move. Like, we are supposed to go out and preach this stuff. Like, that's the only foot above that some Protestants have above us, is like their ineptitude to evangelize. Like, we are supposed to do that. But the narrative, I think it's really just like the whole like scandals, sex scandals within the church. The Pope Francis, his focus on in some of his stuff, and really like if you read some of Francis's like first encyclicals, they were like oddly, and again, I'm not trying to like discount him or anything like that, but they were oddly in line with a lot of like the like early 20th century narratives from some of these people, with like the idea of the technocratic view and so on and so forth. But no, it's something that I feel is very important and a duty for us all to continue to push this message out in some way, shape, or form. And really, I think the best way to do it isn't necessarily going on there like the Protestants do and saying you're all going to hell. I also don't think it's the best way to go about like getting on there and debating some like super uneducated person on TikTok and starting off with like epistemology. Like, you have to introduce these people to the idea of paradigm, the idea of worldview, and the idea of how to think. That's like the whole purpose of this video, was to possibly give some sort of insight to the history of education and how it got to be. I showed, let's see, went through modern education, industrial revolution, progressive movement, talked a little bit about Voltaire, talked a little bit about Horace Mann, beauty of the medieval system, and really just how modern society is so familiar with this college is a scam, college sucks narrative, when in reality, those types of people who preach that don't ever give this concrete explanation. Again, just pushing this relativistic, subjective societal view of like, whoa, we just are left to find truth. And that's because none of these people are actually saints. They don't care about any of this stuff. I'm not trying to say that I'm a saint. I'm trying to pull my information from people that were saints and put that to the surface. But these people proclaim to be the gurus, proclaim to have all the knowledge, but they don't ever expand upon it. And that's just because they're trying to sell you something. They're not trying to save you. So anyway, that's this video. Don't know exactly what the next one is. Gonna do some sort of masterclass video on tag and truly deep dive into that. But yeah, we gotta move more towards this and away from all of this. We got to realize what education actually means, what our end goal with it is, look back in history, find what they were teaching back then, how and what true liberties they had. And yeah, and again, some resources. Michael Sugro is great. The Thomistic Institute has lots of good stuff if you want to educate yourself on what the Thomists believe. There's plenty of homeschool, basically shown to people who homeschool their kids. Lots of information from them that you can use, etc. And with that, that's the video, boys. Y'all have a good evening and peace.